Philosophemes channel, in which we examine the history of Western philosophy. Okay, so when we look at the history of Western philosophy in this episode, what we want to do is we want to remind ourselves of the architectonic of philosophy. So there's going to be a quick overview of the architectonic of philosophy. Then we're going to have a zoomed-in view of the architectonic of philosophy in particular. If you haven't seen the first 3 episodes, this will make more sense as soon as I show you the graphics here in a moment. Next, we're going to examine the logical and historical aspects of the architectonic of philosophy in particular. Recall, by way of architectonic, we can just say, if you think of philosophy as a building, then what we are trying to do is we're trying to zoom out, trying to find a point of view from which we can see the entire architecture of that building, and then be able to identify differences in the architecture and sort of zoom into the various parts of the architecture of that building that is philosophy. Next, we're going to examine something that I like to call the fractal structure view of the architectonic of philosophy in particular. This will make more sense when we get there. Been kind of holding back during the first 3 episodes of referring to this, but now we've covered enough ground that this will be very easy for us to understand now. Next, the relationship between history and art and philosophy. I think that this is very helpful because we often hear philosophy described using terms from art or art history. And then lastly, I want to be sure for us to look at and make sure that we are aware of what is standardly referred to as the Ninefold division of the history of Western philosophy. All right, so if you recall from the first 3 episodes, this is, we could say, an overview of the architectonic of philosophy. And we can divide the architecture of philosophy or the architectonic of philosophy into philosophy in general and philosophy in particular. We suggested that these basic concepts or these categories, basic categories of philosophy or categories of thinking, we could even refer to them as, that they exhaust philosophy in general. I realize that there may be one branch of philosophy that's difficult to locate in this general architecture of philosophy, but I would ultimately locate it in ontology. So down the road, when we start looking at the branches of philosophy in relation to this again, I'll be sure to give a more thorough articulation of the branches as they relate to this very zoomed out view of philosophy. But today we're going to look at philosophy in particular. And as we mentioned before, philosophy in particular refers to the history of philosophy, what has been done in the name of philosophy. Okay, so if we zoom in then to the architectonic of philosophy in particular, we saw already in Seminar 1, Part 1, that the history of Western philosophy can and should and standardly is divided into ancient, Middle Ages, modern, and contemporary, these 4 periods. So this is sometimes referred to as the 4-fold division of the history of Western philosophy. You can see that we're actually continuing to zoom in, right? So after we zoomed in here, we want to now look at the logical and historical aspects to each historical selection. This will make sense as we go a little bit further in, but basically we're doing philosophy in particular. So we're doing the history of philosophy. When we do the history of philosophy, we're going to make some kind of selection from out of the history of philosophy, right? Whether we're going to pick some philosopher, we're going to pick some quote, we're going to pick some text, we're going to pick some question, we're going to pick some puzzle, we're going to pick anything that you can think of that is philosophical. And we're going to be locating that in the history of philosophy. And I want to refer to that as the kind of selection, making a selection from out of the history of philosophy. And we could say that we're making that selection to focus on or to zoom in on. All right. So keeping that in mind, then, when we make that selection, it is possible to talk about the logical and historical aspects of that selection. We are in the history of philosophy, but we're also now going to be looking at logic and history in relation to whatever it is in the history of philosophy that we're talking about. So this will make more sense as we get to the next slide here. What we see then is that historical selection simply means whatever philosopher and or philosophical work we choose to consider. Now, whenever you choose to consider some philosopher quote, some philosopher text, some puzzle, some question. We can relate to that logically and historically. So, for example, logically then, each philosopher and or philosophical work can be identified in regard to the general categories: soteriology, criteriology, and ontology. This is very straightforward and simple. So, in other words, we could say something like, what is Plato's soteriology? What is Aristotle's soteriology? How does this aspect of criteriology relate to other aspects in other historical periods? These kinds of things. So just logically identifying our selection. Historically then, each philosopher and or philosophical work has what I would refer to here as a proximate sphere of influence. And this is very straightforward again. So in other words, each historical selection was influenced by philosophers and philosophical works, and in turn influenced some philosopher or work that came after it in history. Every historical selection has a past, and every historical selection has a future. So whatever historical selection we're talking about, we can relate to it logically, we can identify it within the architecture, for example, and we can relate to it historically. We can identify it in regard to its past and its future. All right. Whatever philosophical or philosophical work we consider, it can be understood from each of the following points of view. This is trust me here. This is really helpful. We're almost there. So you could say, in general, in terms of its historical period, what historical period does it come out of? And then in particular, logically, we can identify the question that we're talking about. We can identify the kind of work that we're talking about. We can identify the questions involved in the text that we're talking about, and so forth. The Nicomachean Ethics, what sorts of questions do we find in the Nicomachean Ethics, right? The types of questions that we find in the Nicomachean Ethics by Aristotle, for example, are very different from the kinds of ideas and questions that we find in Descartes' Meditations. So again, we can identify even these texts logically in terms of the ideas and questions that they pursue. And then lastly here, again, in particular historically, in terms of this selection's proximate spheres of influence. So notice then, in summary, the influences from its past. Those influences may also be understood logically and historically. Are you starting to see the fractal? Are you starting to see the fractal now, right? Those influences may be understood logically, historically, and in terms of style or art, and how the historical selection influenced its future. And that can also be understood logically, historically, and in terms of style or art. So this will become a little bit clearer as we actually start to add some content to this, but the idea is that we're working toward a kind of fractal view. So just as a reminder, we had this puzzle piece. I like these 4 puzzle pieces here in order to illustrate the fourfold division of the history of Western philosophy, and I'm going to use this outline just to remind us of the fourfold division of the history of Western philosophy. So we have the ancient, the Middle Ages, the modern, and the contemporary. And now, here it is, the fractal structure view of the architectonic of philosophy in particular. So all of these words, I chose them very carefully so that everything just lines up. And so this may seem like a mouthful, but if you've been following along, it's radically straightforward. And again, if you have any questions about this, please do drop some questions in the comments section. I'll get to them as soon as I possibly can. But I'd be happy to see what kinds of questions you have about this. So notice that we're looking at the architectonic of philosophy in general when we see soteriology, criteriology, and ontology. And then inside of each of these spheres, these logical spheres, you might say, these architectural spheres, you see the outline of the 4 puzzle pieces, the outline that's representing the fourfold division of the history of Western philosophy. So at this first stage of developing the fractal structure view of the architectonic of philosophy in particular, we could say that soteriology, the general category of soteriology, has a history, and that history is, of course, also divided into the fourfold division of the history of Western philosophy. So now you can see that if it's a soteriological question, for example, that we are pursuing, or some kind of soteriological selection, some soteriological work, maybe a soteriological philosopher, if you want to speak that way, a soteriological work, a soteriological text, we can say that it can be identified and located within one of the divisions of the fourfold division of the history of Western philosophy. The same thing goes for Criteriology, and the same thing goes for Ontology. The idea of the fractal view then emerges whenever we see that all of these divisions can be compared and contrasted with one another. For example, if we have a soteriological question, we can identify which historical period it belongs to. Then we can compare and contrast it to the ways in which that soteriological question is asked and answered in the other historical periods. It's also the case then, as we had mentioned a few slides back, that when we identify, for example, a soteriological question within one of these historical divisions, it is possible then to think of that selection in terms of its spheres of influence, in terms of its past and its future. When we think of it in terms of its past and in terms of its future, we are then able to compare those spheres of influence in terms of the way in which they relate to the categories of the architectonic of philosophy, and also the way in which they relate to the other historical divisions. Initially, with the first few episodes, I kept emphasizing this idea that the architectonic of philosophy can be used to organize your thinking, but there's also a sense now in which you can see that the architectonic of philosophy can be used to naturally develop your thinking in regard to whatever historical selection of philosophy you choose to examine. It immediately points to other aspects of the history of philosophy for you to be able to compare and contrast with whatever historical selection you're examining. So just to recap, I think that it's a super powerful idea. It also really helps in terms of energy expenditure, that if you understand this structure, there is a sense in which it's like applying a kind of hermeneutic, right? You're applying a set of patterns to whatever it is that you're thinking about. You're applying a set of patterns to whatever it is that you're examining in the history of philosophy, and it immediately allows you then to advance to the next thought, right? Whatever that thought may be in terms of who else has asked this question. What are the other answers to this question? Is the answer to the question that I am considering, is that answer more a byproduct of the historical period in which it's taking place than, for example, the exhaustive answer to the question that I'm considering? So all of these are aspects of philosophizing that emerge from this architectonic of philosophy. So again, this is why I think that all this groundwork is very important. And I do want to emphasize just one more time that we just got done talking about the architectonic of philosophy as applied to your own thinking, but you can also use this architectonic of philosophy to apply it to the thinking of others. So when you are listening to or witnessing someone else philosophize, you can ask all of these questions. These are all questions not only of clarification, but questions of philosophy. I mean, there's a sense in which you are locating whatever it is that a person is philosophizing about. You are able to locate that and develop it. So I find all of this to be not only fundamental to philosophical practice, fundamental to philosophizing, but also I think that it is the explication of the natural structure of philosophy. So I would say that there is an internal pattern. There is a pattern of organization inside of philosophy that when you zoom out, when you go to the appropriate point of departure, the appropriate point of view for seeing philosophy, then you're also able to see this deeper natural pattern, this pattern that's already there inside of the structure, the architecture of philosophy. So again, really, really important stuff in my opinion. And it just takes a little bit of practice, to get used to this. So just these last couple ideas then in regard to the history of philosophy. So we have this idea of history and art and philosophy. So historical periods, philosophers, and philosophical works are sometimes characterized in terms of styles of art. For example, those styles being produced during the same time. As an example, we could see Renaissance art. So I'm just going to quickly look at Renaissance art, Baroque art, and postmodern art. So with Renaissance art, we see a shift to non-religious themes. This is the origin of this characteristic of humanistic philosophy. I think that by way of art is the best way to characterize and acknowledge humanism. Otherwise, if you spend a lot of time looking at Renaissance philosophy, you're going to eventually try to define the term humanism. And if you want to define the term humanism in terms of human, you're going to eventually run into some difficulties. So the idea here is that if you think about the art during that historical period and you think about how there was a shift in the themes of what was being painted, for example, and it was a shift from religious themes to more everyday types of themes, then we can characterize that or understand that as humanistic. If that is how we understand humanism and humanistic, then it becomes much easier for us to understand how philosophy during that historical period, how Renaissance philosophy may be understood as humanistic. Lastly, then, in regard to Renaissance art, the introduction of relativity, and really the introduction of relativity here means the use of perspective. So again, notice how this intimate relation between art in the historical period known as the Renaissance and the relation to philosophy. And not only the relationship then between Renaissance art and Renaissance philosophy, but also the way in which Renaissance art is described. So the way that it is described and characterized, and the sense in which those same descriptions and characterizations are then used to refer to philosophy, to Renaissance philosophy. So this is something that we see often, and it does actually lend itself to pretty safe generalizations and accurate generalizations as well, that these descriptions of Renaissance art actually do apply to Renaissance philosophy. So two more aspects here, two more historical periods in terms of art. We're looking at Baroque art. I always think of Leibniz, and I like Deleuze's book on Leibniz. But in regard to Baroque art, then we find these kinds of descriptive terms, that Baroque art is intricate, it is dramatic, it is dynamic, and that it exhibits an emphasis on grandeur and theatricality. Lastly, then, postmodern art. Postmodern art is often described as a fragmentation of form. It is often characterized in terms of subjectivism, banality over originality, politicization over beauty, and popularity over truth. So those are all ways to characterize postmodern art, and of course, those are all ways to characterize postmodern philosophy. So I think that it's important and it's helpful to recognize the relationship here between history and art and philosophy. Okay, lastly then, I think that this is a very helpful division, especially because when I show the fourfold division of the history of Western philosophy, some people are going to say, hey, that's way too general, right? So, okay, well, now we have a more zoomed-in view of the history of philosophy, or a more zoomed-in view of the architectonic of philosophy in particular. And what we see here in this ninefold division, we see the pre-Platonic, so pre-Platonic philosophy. I personally feel as though you'll get this sense as we continue to go through and study philosophy together. But, to my mind, Plato, Aristotle, and Immanuel Kant are just such important figures. I mean, there are so many important philosophers, and we love so many philosophers, and philosophical works, but really some of these figures are so monumental that really history is determined and defined around them. And so I think that it is appropriate to refer to the pre-Platonic philosophers. So we have the first fold is the pre-Platonic philosophers, 600 to 300 BC. The Hellenistic philosophers, 301 to 100 BC. So you can kind of see how the numbers work out here. Roman philosophy, the third division, then Roman philosophy, 101 BC to 400 AD. The fourth division, medieval philosophy, 401 AD to 1400 AD. The fifth division is Renaissance philosophy, and the Renaissance period starts with 1401 and goes to 1600. The next is the early modern period. Early modern period, then this sometimes, so I just want to clarify here that if you're not doing the ninefold division, early modern would refer to actually a smaller division. But here, often 1601 to 1800 is referred to as early modern period because some people like to use the word modern to refer to what in the fourfold division was referred to as contemporary philosophy. So with the fourfold division, you've got modern philosophy. Really, you just have to be clear which standard division you're using as to what these terms mean. And I think that that's actually a relevant and important point because when you're arguing with someone or when you're philosophizing with someone, these are legitimate reasons to ask for clarification. I think some folks think of Socrates as they want to overemphasize the gadfly aspect, right? They want to overemphasize the idea that that Socrates is just annoying people or something like that, and that they want to embrace this idea that if I annoy people, then I'm a philosopher. And I think that misses the mark. I think that misses the point. So I think that it, for example, is perfectly legitimate when somebody is using the terminology like early modern for you to ask for clarification. Like, well, do you mean that in a kind of ninefold division of the history of Western philosophy, or do you mean that in a fourfold division of the history of Western philosophy? I think that's legit. That's not just being an annoying person. So that's early modern, the early modern division, and that is the sixth division of the ninefold division. The seventh division then is the 19th century. Of course, that's 1801 to 1900. The eighth division is the 20th century philosophy. That is 1901 to the year 2000. And then lastly here, the ninth fold or the ninth division of the ninefold division of the history of Western philosophy is the 21st century. So that would be 2001 up to and including today. All right. So again, the topic of this episode was the history of philosophy. What we have done is we have looked at a number of different ways to divide up the history of philosophy. We have understood the history of philosophy as indicating the architectonic of philosophy in particular. And then we also looked at the sense in which there is a logical structure that permeates the architectonic of philosophy, and that if we understand even just the beginnings of that, just what we've discussed here in this episode, if we understand the beginnings of that logical structure, then there's a sense in which these questions ask themselves, right? We are able to just sort of get clear on whatever it is that we're talking about by simply applying the logical structure. I like to think of this as a kind of fractal structure or a fractal structure view, because we can just keep zooming in. And our starting point is some historical selection, some quote, some philosopher, some work, some puzzle, some question, some answer. And then once we have that selection, we are able to locate it logically, locate it historically, and then once we've located it historically, we can further locate it logically and historically. And so as we continue to do that, there's a sense in which we are just continuing to zoom in to a fractal structure view. It's a fractal structure view of the architectonic of philosophy. Thank you so much. Please do like and subscribe and click the bell to be notified. And I'll see you in the next episode.